A young girl's life is a collection of small moments: the morning bus ride, the homework that never gets finished, the quiet rebellion of a late-night phone call. But sometimes, in the span of a single afternoon, all those moments can be erased, leaving behind only questions and a profound, aching silence. This is a story about a girl who vanished in a place where the rain is as constant as the evergreen trees, a mystery that would consume a small town and leave a family in a state of unending grief. And to those of you watching, I invite you to share where you are from as we unravel this heartbreaking case. Her name was Sarah Jenkins, and she was, by all accounts, an ordinary 14-year-old girl living a perfectly ordinary life in the quiet town of Port Orchard, Washington. The year was 2018, a time before the world changed, when teenagers found their freedom on two wheels, and the most pressing concern was the next school dance. Sarah was a kind, bright student with a mop of light brown hair and a smile that lit up her whole face. She loved to read, listened to pop music on her headphones, and was known for her love of the outdoors, especially her frequent bike rides through the forested trails that crisscrossed the town. Her parents, a loving and trusting couple, saw nothing out of the ordinary about their daughter's routine. She was a good kid, she had good friends, and she was always home by dinner. The day everything changed was Tuesday, October 23, 2018. The Pacific Northwest is no stranger to rain, but on that afternoon, a sudden violent storm descended upon the region. The sky turned a bruised gray, and the downpour was so heavy it made the streetlights flicker and the creeks swell with rushing water. Sarah had finished her homework and, despite the worsening weather, told her mother she was going on a quick bike ride to a friend's house a few miles away. Her mother, used to her daughter's independent spirit, gave her a hesitant nod, reminding her to be careful and to not stay out too late. Sarah grabbed her trusty, bright red mountain bike, a birthday gift she treasured, and headed out into the rain. The last person to see her alive was a neighbor, who waved to her from his porch as she pedaled past. The neighbor later told police she was wearing a blue jacket and a backpack, her bright bike a flash of color against the gloomy backdrop of the storm. As the hours passed and the rain intensified, Sarah's mother began to worry. The storm made the roads dangerous, and the creek near the bike trail was known to overflow. She called Sarah's friend, but the friend's mother said Sarah never showed up. A wave of dread, cold and consuming, washed over her. She called her husband, who was working late, and the two of them, their hearts in their throats, got in the car to retrace their daughter's route. They drove through the torrential rain, their headlights cutting through the darkness, their eyes scanning the empty roads and the waterlogged trails. They called out her name, but their voices were lost to the wind and the pounding rain. They found no sign of her, no broken branches, no skid marks, no clue as to what had happened. It was as if Sarah, her red bike, and her entire existence had been washed away by the storm. By the time they called the police, the rain had turned into a full-blown flood, and the search had to be called off until morning. The storm had come and gone, but it had taken something precious with it, leaving a silence that screamed of a devastating loss. The morning after the storm, the rain had stopped, but a new, more profound darkness had settled over Port Orchard. The community, initially paralyzed by the downpour, sprang into action. Hundreds of volunteers, organized by the local police and fire departments, fanned out across the forested trails, the muddy roads, and the banks of the overflowing creeks. It was a search filled with a desperate unspoken hope, a collective belief that a 14-year-old girl couldn't simply disappear. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and silent fear. As the hours stretched on, the search parties found plenty of debris from the storm-uprooted trees, broken fences, and scattered branches, but no sign of Sarah. Her bright red bike, a beacon of hope for searchers, was nowhere to be found. The police investigation began immediately, but it was fraught with challenges. The storm had washed away any potential evidence. The trail that Sarah was believed to be on was a muddy mess, with footsteps and tire tracks completely erased by the torrential rain. The lead detective, a veteran named Officer Martinez, found himself fighting against time and the elements. He interviewed Sarah's family and friends, looking for any sign of trouble at home, or a secret life that Sarah might have been hiding. But the answers were always the same. Sarah was a good kid, she had no enemies, and there was nothing unusual about her behavior leading up to that day. It was a clean slate, a blank page in a case that was screaming for clues. As the days turned into weeks, the posters of Sarah's smiling face became a fixture in every store window and on every street corner. Her photo, with her light brown hair and kind eyes, was broadcast on local news channels and circulated on social media. People called in with tips, but they were all dead ends. A fleeting glimpse of a girl in a blue jacket, a car driving too fast on a back road, but nothing that led to Sarah. The initial surge of public support began to wane, and the reality of a cold case began to set in. The search became less of a frantic sprint and more of a long, painful marathon. For Sarah's parents, the world had stopped turning. Her mother, a woman who had spent her life as a schoolteacher, was now consumed by a single, agonizing question. Where was her daughter? She would stand for hours at the edge of the creek, staring at the rushing water, tormented by the thought that her daughter might have been swept away. Sarah's father, a man who prided himself on his strength and practicality, became a shadow of his former self, his days filled with obsessive phone calls to the police and lonely drives along the trails. A silent, desperate search that never ended. Every rainstorm, every sudden drop in temperature, every milestone like a birthday or a holiday was a fresh reminder of the daughter they had lost. The creek, the bike trail, the quiet streets of their town all had become a permanent monument to a mystery that felt like it would never be solved. The community mourned, but for the Jenkins family, the grief was a living entity, a relentless tide that threatened to drown them in a sea of unanswered questions. As weeks stretched into months and months into years, the disappearance of Sarah Jenkins became a permanent scar on the memory of Port Orchard. The posters, once a symbol of frantic hope, were now faded and tattered, a haunting reminder of a mystery that refused to be solved. The local police department, after exhausting every lead and re-interviewing every witness, had no choice but to file the case away. It was an unsolved cold case, a file gathering dust in a basement office, a painful knot in the career of Officer Martinez, who would often stare at Sarah's picture, replaying the events of that fateful rainy day in his mind. For the Jenkins family, time did not heal. It simply created a new kind of grief, a perpetual state of waiting. Sarah's bedroom remained untouched, a museum to a life frozen in time. The books she was reading were still on her nightstand, a half-finished drawing lay on her desk, and her favorite jeans hung on a hook behind her door. Her parents, once a vibrant and outgoing couple, became reclusive, their lives consumed by a silent, unspoken sorrow. They found themselves clinging to any memory, any sound, any scent that could bring her back to them, even for a moment. Birthdays were especially hard, marking a year she would never grow older, a future she would never have the chance to live. The community, after the initial shock and outpouring of support, slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. Life in a small town moves on, even when a part of its heart is missing. The forested trails where Sarah used to ride her bike were now just trails again, not crime scenes. The creek, which had swollen to a raging river on the night she vanished, returned to its calm, gentle flow, as if it had no knowledge of the tragedy it had witnessed. But for those who knew Sarah, and for those who still remembered, the town held a new, uneasy silence. People still talked about it in hushed tones. A local legend told 2 new generations the story of the girl who disappeared in the storm. During these long years, a strange detail was occasionally mentioned, though it was never considered a solid lead by the police. A few people who lived near the creek recalled seeing a figure with a bright lantern moving along the bank in the days following the storm, long after the official search had ended. The description was always vague, a fleeting glimpse in the dark. The police dismissed it as a concerned neighbor, a private investigator, or even a trick of the light. But for Sarah's father, the image of a silent figure with a lantern became an obsession. He would often drive by the creek at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the light, clinging to the hope that it was a clue, a sign that someone, somewhere, knew something. The Jenkins family never gave up hope. They kept their daughter's name in the public eye through a foundation in her honor, keeping the case alive on social media and in local newspapers. They believed that the truth was still out there, buried somewhere in the wet soil of Washington. And as the 5th anniversary of her disappearance approached, they were preparing themselves for another somber milestone, unaware that the long silence was about to be shattered, and the creek, which had so long held its secrets, was finally ready to give one of them up. 5 years is a long time. It's long enough for a small town to forget, for a case file to turn cold, and for hope to wear thin. For the Jenkins family, it was a half-decade of birthdays, uncelebrated holidays, filled with an empty chair, and a constant low-level hum of pain. But on the exact 5-year anniversary of her disappearance, a strange turn of events brought the case back into the harsh light of day. A group of volunteers, part of a local environmental cleanup effort, was working to clear out debris from a small, seldom-used tributary of the creek that had overflowed that fateful night. The tributary, overgrown with weeds and brambles, had been ignored in the initial frantic search. The volunteers, a small team of students, and a few seasoned locals, were slogging through the muddy banks, pulling out trash and old waterlogged branches. That's when one of them saw a flash of red poking out from beneath a pile of silt and fallen leaves. It was barely visible, buried by years of accumulated sediment and debris. At first they thought it was a child's toy, a discarded piece of junk. But as they dug, the shape became clearer, and a profound silence fell over the group. It was a bicycle frame, rusted and corroded by years of sitting in the damp earth and water. Its once bright red color was now a dull, earthy brown, but the distinct shape of a mountain bike was undeniable. The volunteer team leader, a man who had lived in Port Orchard his entire life, immediately recognized the bike. It was a famous symbol of a local tragedy. He quickly called the police. Officer Martinez, now a captain, was the one who answered the call. He had moved on from active duty, but never from the case. The news hit him like a physical blow. 5 years of nothing, and now this. He rushed to the scene, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and a faint, terrifying hope. As the team carefully extricated the bike from the mud, the sight of it was chilling. The tires were flat, the chain was rusted solid, and the frame was slightly bent, but it was otherwise intact. There was no sign of a rider, no torn clothing or personal effects. It was just the bike, a silent witness to a story no one knew. The location of the bike was both a revelation and a new mystery. The tributary was a little over a mile from the main trail Sarah was believed to have taken. It was an area that had been searched, but not thoroughly, in the immediate aftermath of the storm. It was possible the bike was simply washed there by the floodwaters, but it seemed unlikely. The creek's current would have taken it in a different direction. It was also strange that the bike was not broken into pieces. If it had been swept away by a violent storm, it should have been shattered against the rocks. The bike's condition suggested it had been placed there, or carefully hidden, and had not been a victim of the raging floodwaters. For the first time in 5 years, the case had a tangible piece of evidence, and with that evidence came a new, horrifying question. If the storm didn't take her, what or who did? The discovery of the bike had finally broken the case open, but it pointed to something far more sinister than a simple accident. The discovery of the bike was a seismic event for the community of Port Orchard. The faded missing posters were taken down and replaced with news banners declaring new evidence in Jenkins' case. The media circus returned, its cameras and reporters a jarring reminder of a tragedy that had never truly left. But for the Jenkins family, the news was a cruel mix of relief and renewed agony. For 5 years, they had clung to a hope that was slowly dying. Now, a tangible piece of their daughter's life had returned, but its appearance brought with it a terror they had not known before, the fear that she was not a victim of a terrible accident, but of something far more deliberate. The bike was immediately taken to the forensics lab. The expectation was high surely. After 5 years, the mud and rust had protected some kind of evidence, but the results were devastating. The forensic team, led by a seasoned specialist, found nothing. The bike had been in the creek for so long that any fingerprints or DNA had been completely washed away. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn fabric. The bike was just a bike, an object left to the elements. The only strange detail was the condition of the tires. They were still fully inflated, a small impossibility that defied the logic of a 5-year submersion. The case, which had just been blown wide open, now seemed to slam shut again, leaving everyone with a frustrating and empty feeling. Officer Martinez, now a captain and a weary veteran, refused to be deterred. He had spent years staring at a blank case file. He knew the bike's location was too strange to be a coincidence. He had the creek thoroughly re-examined, with search teams looking for any other clues that might have been buried with the bike. They found nothing. As he reviewed the case files and the new evidence, a chilling thought began to take hold. What if the bike wasn't there all along? What if it had been placed there more recently? The theory was simple but horrifying. Someone had kept the bike for 5 years and had just recently placed it in the creek. It was a taunt, a message to the police and to Sarah's family. But who would do such a thing, and why? The action of placing the bike, and its relatively intact condition, suggested a meticulous, calculating mind. It pointed to a killer who was not only a monster but one who derived a sick pleasure from the pain he was causing. The bike, once a symbol of childhood joy, had become a symbol of a cruel, twisted game. The new investigation followed this grim path. Captain Martinez and his team began looking for anyone who had left town around the time of the disappearance and had recently returned. They created a profile of a potential suspect, a loner with a history of antisocial behavior. The case was no longer about finding a lost girl. It was about hunting a ghost, a perpetrator who had been clever enough to leave a clue that was almost perfectly clean. And as the police dug deeper into the lives of everyone in the community, they would find that the small town of Port Orchard held a secret far darker than a missing girl, a secret that had been hidden in plain sight. The new theory that the bike had been planted in the creek transformed the investigation from a cold case into a chilling cat-and-mouse game. Captain Martinez, haunted by the thought that a killer had been toying with the town for 5 years, pulled the old case files and began to review them with a fresh perspective. Every interview, every alibi, and every statement was scrutinized, not for what it said, but for what it didn't. The focus was now on those who had a personal connection to Sarah, or to the area around the creek, but who had been easily dismissed in the initial chaos. The first person to be re-interviewed was the neighbor who had seen Sarah ride past his house. The man, an older gentleman named Arthur, was a quiet, unassuming retiree who had always been cooperative with the police. He had given his statement and was never considered a suspect, but this time Captain Martinez didn't ask about what he saw. He asked about Arthur's life in the days and weeks after the disappearance. He learned that Arthur, a former engineer, had an intricate workshop in his basement and spent his free time building things. He had a meticulous, methodical mind. This detail, insignificant 5 years ago, now took on a new, unsettling quality. The police also looked again at the boy Sarah was supposed to meet that day. His name was Michael, a close friend who lived a few miles down the road. He had been devastated by her disappearance and had a solid alibi. He had been home with his parents. But a re-examination of the original files revealed a small, forgotten detail from his mother's statement. She had said that Michael was upset that day because he had just gotten into an argument with Sarah over the phone. Michael had insisted it was just a small, silly disagreement, but the police now wondered if it was a flimsy motive at best. But in a cold case, even the smallest crack in a story could lead to a breakthrough. The investigation also led the police to re-examine the behavior of those who lived near the creek. They found a pattern of odd behavior from a local man named David, a reclusive artist who lived in a cabin deep in the woods near the tributary where the bike was found. In the days following Sarah's disappearance, David had been seen by several neighbors going on long, solitary walks along the creek bed with a lantern. When questioned 5 years ago, he had said he was looking for rare moss and fungi for his art, and the police had no reason to disbelieve him. But now, with the bike's discovery, the image of a man with a lantern, meticulously searching the creek, felt less like an artist and more like a killer, making sure his crime was well hidden. The pieces were beginning to fit, not with forensic evidence, but with a pattern of behavior and a chilling sense of intuition. The new investigation wasn't about finding a needle in a haystack. It was about realizing that the haystacks themselves were the clues. The police began to build a profile of a killer who was local, meticulous, and who had a reason to be out on that stormy night, and a motive for keeping a twisted secret. The quiet town of Port Orchard, which had spent 5 years believing its dark secret was the Rainstorm itself, was about to discover that the real monster had been a familiar face all along. The re-examination of old interviews and the new theory of a meticulously planned crime led Captain Martinez and his team down a darker path. The three suspects, the quiet retiree Arthur, the childhood friend Michael, and the reclusive artist David, were all re-interviewed. But this time, the questions were more pointed. They were not looking for an alibi for the night of the storm, but for a break in their character, a tiny detail that could reveal a hidden motive. The answers were always the same. They were innocent, they had no connection to the crime, and they had nothing to hide. The investigation had once again hit a wall, but Martinez refused to give up. He had a gut feeling that one of these men was responsible, that the answer was hidden in a small, easily overlooked detail. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place, the old police case log. As a young detective, Martinez had been a stickler for detail, logging everything, no matter how insignificant. He found a note he had written 5 years ago, a single line about a local report of an unusual sound. A neighbor who lived near the creek had called the police a few nights after the storm, complaining about a strange rhythmic noise coming from the woods. The neighbor, an elderly woman with hearing issues, had dismissed it as a branch rubbing against a tree in the wind and had not pressed the issue. The report was never followed up on, and it was quickly forgotten. Now, 5 years later, Martinez read the note, and a chill went down his spine. He immediately sent a team of officers to the creek, asking them to search for any signs of a disturbance. The search team, now equipped with modern forensic technology, meticulously scoured the area. The dense undergrowth and the shifting terrain had made the first search impossible, but now, with a new focus, they found it. Tucked away in a small secluded grotto just off the main creek, a place that would have been hidden from a general search, they found a small piece of metal. It was a single, rusted bolt, the kind used to hold together a bicycle frame. It was a minuscule piece of evidence, but it was enough. The bolt was tested and found to be a perfect match for a piece missing from Sarah's bike. It was not a huge discovery, but it was enough to prove that the bike had been taken apart at some point. It proved that someone had spent time at the creek, meticulously disassembling the bike and then reassembling it. A bizarre and chilling act that pointed to a mind that was not only methodical but deeply disturbed. The police now knew what to look for. They returned to the home of the reclusive artist, David, who lived in a cabin just a few hundred yards from the grotto. They had obtained a warrant and had already searched his property, but this time, they weren't looking for a body. They were looking for tools. In a locked shed behind his cabin, they found a collection of old, rusty tools. Among them was a set of wrenches and a pair of pliers that had traces of red paint on them, a perfect match for Sarah's bike. A new forensics report was ordered, and the results were devastating. They found traces of Sarah's DNA on the tools. The case was now all but solved. The quiet, unassuming artist, a man who had been overlooked for 5 years, was their killer. But the mystery of where Sarah was remained. The tools and the bike were a start, but the police needed to find a body, and they knew the truth. Whatever it was hidden in the darkest corner of the reclusive artist's mind. Armed with the forensic evidence linking David to Sarah's bike, the police brought him in for questioning. The reclusive artist, a man who had spent 5 years in the shadows of the community, sat across from Captain Martinez, his face a mask of weary resignation. He denied everything at first, sticking to his original story about his love for nature and his solitary walks. But as Martinez laid out the evidence, the rusted bolt, the paint on his tools, the DNA trace, the artist's facade began to crack. His eyes darted around the room, his hands trembled, and a new unsettling look of fear and desperation flickered across his face. Martinez, a veteran of countless interrogations, knew that this wasn't just a simple confession. There was more to the story, a motive buried deep beneath the surface of the man's reclusive life. He didn't ask, "Did you do it?" Instead, he asked about the art. He asked about the pieces David had created in the 5 years since Sarah's disappearance. The pieces that were stored in a locked room in his cabin. The question hit David like a physical blow. His head snapped up, his eyes widening in a mix of panic and a strange, almost manic pride. Slowly, carefully, David began to speak. The truth that poured out was not one of simple violence, but of something far more chilling and twisted. He confessed to seeing Sarah that day, to watching her ride into the storm, but he didn't attack her then. He saw her as a muse, a perfect subject for his next masterpiece. He had been struggling for years, unable to find the perfect inspiration for his art. His work was about decay, about the beauty in death and loss, but he felt it lacked authenticity. When he saw Sarah, a vibrant young girl in a raging storm, he saw his chance. He followed her from a distance, watching her as she took a wrong turn, her bike sliding into a ditch near the overflowing creek. He didn't help her. He watched her as she struggled, and he saw, in her desperation, the perfect moment for his art. He then, with a chilling calmness, recounted how he approached her, offering to help, and then, in an act of cold-blooded cruelty, he took her. He admitted to killing her, not in a fit of rage, but as a calculated act to create his final, most authentic piece of art. He had taken her body, her backpack, and her bike, and had hidden them, planning to use them in a macabre creation. He admitted to disassembling the bike, hiding it for 5 years, and then, in a moment of twisted inspiration, placing it back in the creek for the world to find. It was his way of getting credit for his work, of letting the world know his masterpiece was real. The police were horrified. The case was not a tragedy of bad timing, but a cold, deliberate act of a deeply disturbed individual. He had not only murdered a young girl, but he had also used her life as a canvas for his sick art. But a crucial piece of the puzzle remained. He had confessed to the murder, but he refused to reveal where he had hidden Sarah's body. The location, he said, was the final secret of his masterpiece, a piece of art that would only be revealed on his own terms. His confession was a partial truth, a terrifying glimpse into a mind that saw a child's life as a canvas. But the final, most devastating secret was still hidden, waiting to be found. The police now had their killer, but they were no closer to finding Sarah and bringing her home. With the confession secured, Captain Martinez and his team faced a new, agonizing challenge. Finding Sarah's body, David the killer, was a puzzle unto himself. He had confessed to the murder, but remained stubbornly silent about the location of her remains. He saw her final resting place, not as a grave, but as the crowning piece of his macabre art, a work he refused to reveal to an unappreciative world. The police tried everything. They offered him a deal. They appealed to his conscience. They tried to break his will, but he would not budge. His silence was his final act of control, his ultimate power over the girl he had taken and the town he had terrorized. Refusing to let Sarah's final fate remain a secret, the police began a new, more intense search of David's property. They brought in a specialized team equipped with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. They knew the body had to be close, somewhere on the vast forested land around his cabin, but they found nothing. The land was full of dense, old growth, and the shifting terrain made the search a grueling, frustrating process. The police were desperate. They knew David was playing a game with them, and they had to win. Captain Martinez, feeling the weight of 5 years of waiting, re-examined David's art. He spent hours poring over photos of his sculptures and paintings, looking for a clue. David's work was always a combination of natural elements: wood, stone, moss, and man-made objects. His recurring themes were decay, rebirth, and the transformation of a living thing into a permanent form. He realized David's art was his way of memorializing his crimes, and the location of Sarah's body would be his final, most significant piece. He began to look for a detail that had been overlooked, a single, hidden clue in David's portfolio, and then he saw it. In an old photo of David's cabin, taken years ago, a new large statue had been constructed near a well on the property. It was a strange, abstract piece made of jagged rocks and old metal. At the base of the statue, a small, intricate carving had been etched into the stone. It was a small, elegant S and a single etched date, October 23, 18. It was a chilling signature, a permanent record of his most valued work. The police had searched the property but had never given a thought to the strange, artistic statue. It was just a weird piece of art, a fitting eccentricity for a reclusive artist. But Martinez knew better. The statue was not a work of art. It was a grave marker. The police immediately returned to the cabin. They found the well and, with a grim sense of dread, began to dismantle the statue. The rocks were heavy, and the work was slow, but they were determined. As they removed the final piece of jagged stone, they found a small, man-made crypt carved into the earth at the base of the well. And inside, wrapped in a plastic sheet and carefully preserved, was Sarah's body. She was still in the same blue jacket she had been wearing the day she disappeared, her backpack still on her back. The police had finally found her. She was not a victim of a storm, but a casualty of a sick mind that saw her life as a tool for his art. The discovery brought a final, devastating wave of grief to the community. But for Sarah's family, it brought an end to the agonizing search. They could finally bring their daughter home. The discovery of Sarah's body brought a chilling finality to the town of Port Orchard. The community, which had held on to a sliver of hope for 5 years, was now forced to confront a truth far more sinister than a tragic accident. The rain, the storm, the overflowing creek, none of it had been a killer. The true monster was a man they had all seen, a reclusive artist who had hidden his sick obsession in plain sight. The arrest of David sent shockwaves through the community, and the revelation of his motive, that Sarah's life was simply a canvas for his art, was a sickening conclusion to a long, agonizing mystery. He was convicted and sentenced, but for the Jenkins family, no sentence could ever be enough. For Sarah's parents, the pain was still there, but it was a different kind of pain. The grief of the unknown had been replaced by the sorrow of a devastating truth. They could finally lay their daughter to rest. The funeral was a somber and private affair, a chance to say a final goodbye that had been denied to them for so long. They buried her in her favorite jacket, the same one she had been wearing on that fateful day. But a small, symbolic piece of her memory was kept for the public. Her bright red mountain bike, the first clue to her disappearance, was cleaned and placed in a display case at the local police station, a silent testament to the little girl who had been taken from her community. The case of Sarah Jenkins became a permanent part of the town's history, a somber, cautionary tale that lived on in hushed tones and silent prayers. The forested trails where she used to ride were still used, but now, a small memorial stands at the edge of the woods. A simple wooden cross with her name and a single, heartfelt message, "Forever in our hearts." The creek, which had so long held its secret, now flows with the constant, gentle rhythm of a memory that will never be forgotten. And for Officer Martinez, who had carried the weight of the unsolved case for 5 years, the closure was bittersweet. He had found the truth, but the cost was a deep, personal understanding of the darkness that can exist in the world, a darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary of faces. This is a story about the fragility of life and the unwavering strength of a parent's love. It is a reminder that even in the quietest corners of the world, there can be secrets too dark to comprehend. But it is also a story about hope, that even after a storm washes away every single clue, and even after 5 long years, the truth will always find a way to emerge from the darkness, and a loving daughter will finally be brought home.